Working our way through the Lojong, the mind training text composed by the third Dodrup Rinpoche, called Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment. So there are two major parts to this text: how to use suffering as the path to enlightenment, how to use happiness as the path to enlightenment. And so in Lama Zopa's teaching on this text, and also in the text itself, most of the information, most of the advice is related to how to use suffering as the path to enlightenment, and a little related to how to use happiness. So each of these parts is approached through relative truth and then through absolute truth. So to begin with, how to use suffering as the path to enlightenment. So what we discussed before lunch was that as problems are inevitable, if we don't train our mind in how to deal constructively or positively with problems, then what happens is that even the smallest problem can disturb our mind in a major way. And we can think of probably times in our own lives when we've been like this. For me, the example is when I was a teenager, and at other times in our lives. So we know people, or even ourselves have probably done this, where the slightest thing, like a meal not being quite the way we ordered it, or a bed not being quite as comfortable as we wanted, or some transport being late, or someone doing not quite what we wanted, then suddenly, because we haven't trained our mind, it becomes a huge problem. And we think obsessively about it, and we go on and on about it, and we talk to other people about it, complain to other people. So just think of the times when you haven't had a good night's sleep, and how somehow this is information that you very rarely keep to yourself, and you usually bore the people around with you about what a bad night you had and how difficult the day you're going through is. So it's if we don't draw a limit, if we don't institute some techniques and methods to deal with our mind and the problems that we encounter, then it becomes this state that's described as all appearances and perceptions arising as enemies. So this means there's nothing satisfactory in anything around us or any people around us. And we feel a lot of anxiety and dissatisfaction ourselves, and also disturb the people around us just because of some minor problem and our inability to deal with it. And so just remembering that Lama Zopa Rinpoche gave the example of Milarepa, who in paintings holds his hand to his right ear, because for him, it's not that all appearances and perceptions appear as enemies, but everything that appears to him appears as a friend, as someone to help him on the spiritual path. It all appears as Dharma advice, as spiritual advice. And so what we have to come to terms with is that we live in a degenerate age, that conditions are not improving, shall we say, and that if we don't institute methods to deal with problems, then we ourselves will experience more and more suffering. So Dodrup Rinpoche suggests that what we need to do first is get rid of the attitude of only wanting not to suffer. So there's no use in seeing problems as undesirable, because inevitably they're going to happen, and we just increase our own suffering if we resist them or become angry because we're experiencing problems. And what he suggests is that over and over again in our minds, we just think, from now on, whatever suffering I face, I will not become anxious. And train yourself to feel a strong feeling of courage whenever you're dealing with difficult situations. So first off, in this section, Dodrup Rinpoche points out the uselessness of regarding suffering as purely harmful and undesirable. So here he quotes the famous verse from Shantideva in A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where Shantideva points out that if you are facing a problem and you can do something to solve the problem, then there's no need to be unhappy about it. And if you're facing a problem that has no solution, then it doesn't help to be unhappy about it. So this is very common sense advice, but when you think about it, we don't always institute it. We don't always calmly analyze when we're facing something that we've labeled a problem and work out that there is something we can do about it and do it, or work out that there is no solution to the problem and don't upset our minds about it. We tend to become obsessive and complain over and over about the situations we're facing. So next, Rinpoche Rinpoche points out the tremendous pain and stress involved in regarding situations as problems, that it makes us anxious, depressed, fearful, and that if we do have the strength of mind to deal courageously and constructively with the situation we're facing, then we become able to bear even the hardest suffering. And he points out that even the hardest suffering will feel as light and easy to bear as cotton. But if you're dominated by anxiety and fearfulness, then even the smallest problem is absolutely unbearable. And your mind becomes oppressed by a continuous feeling of unhappiness. So then, after you've rejected the attitude of only wanting yourself not to suffer, then you need to cultivate an attitude of being joyful that suffering arises. So this is like almost directly opposed to the way we normally act in our everyday life, because most of us don't want the slightest suffering, the slightest problem, although we can be quite patient and tolerant of suffering occurring to other people. So what we need to do here, and I told you the story of Lama Atisha's cook, where he took this really bad-tempered Bengali cook to him to Tibet. And when people asked him why he had such a nasty person around him, he said that he brought him as a way to practice patience. So even though he was a very angry, mean-minded man that nobody else wanted to deal with, then Lama Atisha especially brought him as a means to develop his mind in the path to enlightenment. So that's the kind of developed practitioner, if you like. And along the way, first we need to accept and not react negatively to the problems that we're experiencing. And then as we develop our mind in the path, we can actually, the yogis actually pray to experience problems and sufferings, especially on behalf of others. So how do we develop an attitude that is happy when problems arise, what we label as problems arise? So there are various techniques and methods to apply to do this. So the basic thing here is that we're using problems to help us in the development of our mind, in training our mind, and in developing our mind towards the ultimate goal of achieving enlightenment for the benefit of others. So be aware that it does involve training the mind. This is not an instant process, and just by reading or hearing about these methods, your mind isn't going to instantly transform, that you're going to need to apply these methods over and over again in your daily life. And the suggestion from the text, and my suggestion, is that you start small, that you start by applying these particular methods to everyday problems, small everyday problems that you experience. And by training your mind in this way, you'll find that they bother you less and less, those everyday problems. And then when some big problem happens, then you'll have methods, techniques that you can institute immediately that can help to relieve the suffering associated with those problems. So before lunch, we discussed the first two of the suggestions that came from Rinpoche Rinpoche. So the first is that if you have a problem, then you can use that problem to train in renunciation. So again, just reminding you that renunciation has certain Christian connotations, but a more accurate translation would be the determination to be free or to exit samsara. So the point here, as I point out in talking about the 4 preliminaries to thought training, is that we have to have a realistic or accurate assessment of samsara. And here we're not just talking about the environment that we live in. I'm talking about kind of pollution, ordinary pollution. What we're talking about is that because we cycle in samsara over and over again under the control of negative karma and delusions, that when a problem occurs, we shouldn't be surprised. There shouldn't be any question like, why me? Because during beginningless lives, during countless lives, we've created various negative karmas under the control of delusions. And that it's just a matter of time if we have those causes on our mind stream before some external conditions cause them to ripen in a particular suffering or problem. So when something happens, however big or small, then we can just think, this is nothing surprising, this is nothing exceptional. It's just reminding me of the nature of my existence. And ideally, as well as reminding you, it should prompt you to think about how you escape from that kind of existence. And so there's that famous verse in Lama Zopa where it says that rather than see our world or the way what we live in as a beautiful park, we should see it as a prison. And for most of us, if things are going well, if we're feeling relatively healthy, we've got good relationships with people, we're maybe happy with our job, the weather's good, then it's unlikely that we're seeing our existence as a prison. But if we think deeply about the Dharma, we think deeply about the different types of sufferings that I explained this morning, the suffering of pain, and particularly the suffering of change and pervasive compounding suffering, then as long as we're under the control of negative karma and delusions, then there's no real, actual, ultimate happiness in our lives. There can be some immediate transient happiness, or what we label happiness or pleasure, but it's actually the suffering of change. So anytime anything goes wrong in your life, then rather being surprised or shocked or negative about it, then just think, oh, this is just reminding me about the nature of the existence I'm caught in, and it's reminding me that I need to work on becoming freed, to becoming liberated from this type of existence. As Dodrupa Rinpoche says here, alas, samsara is an endless and bottomless ocean of suffering. And turn your mind in the direction of liberation, which is ultimate happiness, unchanging happiness. So there's two levels of ultimate liberation, ultimate happiness. So liberation from samsara, and then the peerless happiness, the ultimate happiness of full enlightenment. So next, the second one, Dodrupa Rinpoche suggests that we use any suffering or problem we experience to train in taking refuge. So as this is a Buddhist text, then the refuge that we're talking about here are Guru, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha are known as the three jewels, or the three precious sublime ones. And it's by taking refuge in these three jewels that you actually become a Buddhist, which in Tibetan is actually an inner being. It's called an inner being. So for those who are Buddhist, then when a problem arises, then as Dodrupa Rinpoche suggests, you can think throughout all my lives, one after the other, the only source of refuge from the continuous pain of all this fear, which will never fail, is the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, the three jewels. So I must rely on them totally, and whatever happens, I will never renounce them. So when some big or small problem arises for you, then think about your refuge. Think of who you go to, who you trust in for protection from the sufferings of samsara. So for Buddhists, it could be the Guru, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. For a Christian, it'd be God, or Jesus Christ, or Mary Magdalene. For a Muslim, it could be Allah. For other people, you might have your own thing that you take refuge in. So when a problem arises, then think about what you trust in, what you take refuge in, and sincerely from your heart, go for refuge, take refuge, if you're a Buddhist, in Guru, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So now, the new one in the list, number 3, Dodrupa Rinpoche says that you can use your problems to remove arrogance or pride. So he says here, look into the way in which you yourself have no freedom, as explained above, and never go beyond being controlled by suffering. Then make up your mind to put a stop to both self-esteem and pride, which destroy anything good or positive, and contempt and disdain towards other people. So as we all know, it's quite difficult to feel proud when you're experiencing problems. You think about times in your life when you've had a relationship fail or a business fail or some work situation fail, when you've not succeeded in something you've tried very hard for, then it's hard to feel proud when you've failed at something. And so this is a positive result of the problem of failing at things, of having problems and suffering, that it helps to reduce your pride. And as I pointed out this morning, the biggest disadvantage of being a proud person, being an arrogant person, is it makes you impervious to learning. Because you kind of feel proud and think you know everything, then you're not open to learning from other people and to learning from the teachings. So this is an advantage of having a problem or a suffering, that it helps to reduce your pride, increases your humility, and makes you less conceited and less contemptuous of other people. So one quote that I've always found helpful, I've come across in different forms, in different verses, is that when talking about the way we normally behave, it says that towards people we regard as superior, we're envious or jealous. Towards those we regard as equals, we're competitive. And towards those who we regard as lower than us in terms of their situation, we usually manifest contempt. So when we fail in a particular situation or have a particular problem or suffering, then it reduces our arrogance, our pride, and increases our humility. So the next benefit, the fourth benefit that Dorje Rinpoche points out of having problems or suffering, is that we can use it to purify harmful and negative actions. So this, of course, relies on the Buddhist understanding of karma, or the law of causes and their consequences. So just to remind you of the 4 laws of karma that I briefly outlined this morning. And this is what we have to reflect on quite carefully when we're experiencing suffering or problems. The infallibility of karma, or the fact that karma is definite. And so this means that if we do positive actions and have positive thoughts, these result in a positive result of happiness, whether in this life or in future lives. Karma has a tendency to increase enormously, and this applies to both positive and negative karma. So we can do some small action, some small positive action in this life, and it can result in happinesses in hundreds of lifetimes. But the one to watch out for is that if we do even a small negative action, small negative karma, that it can ripen in future lives in hundreds of experiences of problems or sufferings. And then we need to remind ourselves that we never face the results of something we haven't created the cause for. So again, this is just reminding you that when some suffering or problem arises, that there's nothing outside and no one outside to blame. That anything external is merely a condition for our experiencing that suffering. And the cause we have is the internal cause, negative karmas and delusions on our mind stream. So I was going to say natural tendency, but our usual tendency is to blame something outside or someone outside for the way we're feeling, especially if we're feeling bad. But as a Buddhist, if we believe in the laws of karma, then we can't get away with that. If we analyze closely, then we have to accept full responsibility for whatever we're experiencing, good or bad. And while we're happy to take responsibility for creating the causes for all the good things we experience, we're not so ready to accept that every negative thing that happens to us is something we've created the cause of. And the final law of karma, the fourth law of karma, is that any karma we've created will never get lost or be wasted. So it doesn't have a use-by date. It's not that after a certain number of lifetimes, the karma expires and you don't experience the results. If it's negative karma, the way to not experience the results of negative karma. So there's a quote in the text that says the only good quality that negative karma has is that it can be purified. So there are various methods in Buddhism to purify negative karma. And there are standard methods. You may have heard of some of them: prostrations, 35 Buddhist confession, Vajrasattva practice, particular practices. But generally, with any, to purify any negative karma, there are what are called the four remedial powers, the four opponent powers. And as I pointed out this morning, the strongest of these in terms of purifying negative actions is to feel genuine regret from your heart at having done that action that harmed yourself and others. So when you experience a suffering or problem, then if you're Buddhist and have faith in the laws of karma, then you should immediately bring them to mind and take full responsibility for what you're experiencing. There's no one and nothing outside to blame. And I was trying to memorize a verse this week related to this, in relation to how you deal or how you stop yourself blaming outside. And it's from Shantideva, and it goes something like, everything arises from causes and conditions, and nothing governs itself. So I know what I tend to do, because I have quite a judgmental mind, is when I'm facing some problem or some undesirable situation, that I'm very quick to blame outside, to not accept that responsibility for it, and to not take into account and to somehow feel that those people outside do have the responsibility for the suffering that I'm experiencing, and not to think further ahead the way that Shantideva does in terms of, a person being hit by a stick, to kind of recognize that that person that I'm obsessing about and imputing all sorts of negative things to is under the control of their own karmic propensities and forces. I seem to see them as some self-existent person that's hurting me or harming me and my situation. But in some ways, none of us is responsible or in control of what we're doing, in the sense that we're under the control of negative karma and delusions. So this is quite confronting, but can give you a real insight into how to deal with problems and suffering. And the thing is not to externalize them, not to project them, the causes, onto other people, to accept that you have the inner causes, and that if you don't want to continue to experience these similar kinds of problems, then you have to deal with those inner causes. You have to stop creating negative karma. You have to, as much as you can, with your body, speech, and mind, stop negative actions. And importantly, to do as much as you can to purify the negative actions you've already created. So again, when we're talking about these beginningless lifetimes, then we've done all sorts of good things and bad things. And so when a kind of common purification practice that Buddhists do is called Vajrasattva practice, where you have a 100-syllable mantra, and you usually, it's a tantric practice, and you usually have an initiation and you're given a commitment to recite 100,000 of these mantras. So Tibetans who are accustomed to reciting mantras can do it quite quickly, sometimes in 6 weeks. But Lama Yeshe, it was a practice that he usually gave his students when, after they'd done Lamrim meditations, done Kopan courses, then usually the next practice he gave them was Vajrasattva initiation and retreat. And he asked them to make a commitment to do a 3-month retreat on Vajrasattva. So during that retreat, you're encouraged to bring to mind, first of all the things you remember, the negative things you remember doing in this life, which takes quite a while, and can be quite surprising in terms of, when you read about the different subtle karmas. There are kind of we may think we're a good person in that we don't go around murdering other people and usually don't go around stealing things. But there are a lot of more subtle things that in a Vajrasattva retreat, it suddenly occurs to you, oh, that's right. Because I remember what occurred to me was that when I was at university, my brother was a public servant and working in administration. And I thought it was quite fine for him to bring home copy paper for me to use as a university student to print out anything on my assignments and things. And it never occurred to me, when you look at the subtle things of not stealing, the actual Tibetan terms for not stealing is taking what isn't given, which is more subtle, right, than seeing some object and just taking it. It's taking something that hasn't been given or offered to you. And so then I realized I had more to purify than I expected, and in many aspects. So during the retreat, you usually read about karma and the subtle points of karma and think about what you've done. But then at a certain point, you exhaust your memory of all the negative things you've done in this life. And then you're encouraged to just think about all your beginningless, countless other lives and all the negative actions you've done in those lives that you don't necessarily remember now unless you have clairvoyance. So I had a friend who was doing Vajrasattva retreat in Tashid Retreat Center, and she made me laugh one day because she just said, oh yeah, I just admitted all, I killed it, because there's all these different levels and details of, I killed my mother and father, I kind of killed an arhat, I did this, I did that. So it's like, we may think we're good people, that we're not actively evil or bad people, but in actual fact, even in this life, but especially in the beginningless past lives that we don't remember, we've done all sorts of negative actions. And if you want to know or get an idea of the negative actions you may have done, then it's good to examine your experiences in this life. So for example, people who have a lot of illness in this life, then that's the karmic result usually of taking the lives of others or shortening the lives of others. So you read up on karma and see those kind of karmic results, and then you can kind of get a picture of what might have led you to this particular rebirth with the particular experiences that you're having. And none of us like the negative experiences. So if you don't like the negative experiences and you don't want to continue to experience them, so what it encourages you to do is not only purify negative karma generally, and specifically the negative karmas that you remember committing in this life, but also makes you very careful about your actions of body, speech, and mind. Because if you have faith that the sufferings and problems you're experiencing are the result of previous negative actions and negative thoughts, then of course, it makes sense that you try to reduce those negative actions and thoughts because you don't want to experience similar suffering in the future. So again, this can be a benefit, if you like, of having a suffering or problem, that it makes you think about karma. It makes you think about the consequence of your thoughts and actions, and it gives you impetus to purify them. And it also gives you impetus, strong determination not to commit negative karmas again. So here, I'll just read the paragraph related to this from Dodruch Rinpoche. All this suffering that you have experienced, and sufferings which are unimaginably greater still, all come from nothing but your harmful negative thought actions. So reflect carefully about the infallibility of karma, the law of cause and effect, the tendency of karma to increase enormously, that you will never face the results of something you have not done, and that what you have done will never go to waste. For this reason, you should keep in mind that if you really do not want to suffer, then you must give up the cause of suffering, which is negativity. Put all your energy into acknowledging and purifying, by means of the four powers, all the negative actions you have amassed up until now, and firmly resolve to avoid doing them in the future. So that's the fourth benefit that can come from having problems or suffering. So the fifth benefit suggested by Dodruch Rinpoche is that you can use your suffering and problems to find joy in positive action. So again, this relates to karma. I'll read the paragraph first. Recognize that if you are truly enthusiastic about being happy, which is the reverse of suffering, then you have got to make an effort to practice the cause of happiness, which is positive action. Go over this in your mind in different ways and at some length, and explore what you can do to make your positive beneficial actions increase. So again, this is contemplating the laws of karma, but looking at the positive results, positive causes and positive effects or consequences, rather than the negative ones. And so if you accept the law of karma, that karma is definite, that positive thoughts and actions result in happiness, whether in this life or future lives, then it encourages you when you're having a suffering or problem, and we know we'd much rather not have that problem, and ideally that we'd much rather feel happy, that then we have to explore the karmic causes of happiness, the happiness that we're searching for. And so generally they're the opposite of so there are the 10 non-virtuous actions and the 10 virtuous actions. So for example, if you want the happiness of, and there's no guarantee this happens in this life, you know, we're all, because of the vast perspective, the broad perspective we're working from in Buddhism, we're thinking about future lives as well, not just this life. And so if you want happiness, it can ripen now, depending on the strength of your practice and the objects you do the practice in relation to, but more likely to ripen in future lives as happiness. Then you have to create the positive causes in this life for your future happiness. And so, for example, if you want things like good health and long life, then you do things like saving the lives of animals, doing what you can to save animals. So, for example, there's Lama Zopa Rinpoche, of course, does this extensively. And the main place where the liberating of animals happens is in Singapore, where I can't remember now, but it's millions of sentient beings have been saved over the years in Singapore. And so you can sponsor that to happen. But even little things like, you know, if you see an insect in water and seems to be drowning, then you can save it, rescue it from that fear of drowning. And anything you can do that prolongs the life of others then is creating karmic causes for your own longer life and good health, either in this life or in future lives. So if you have a suffering or problem and a sort of devoid of happiness and joy, then if you think about how you actually obtain that happiness that you seek, then you have to start thinking about positive actions and positive thoughts. And so therefore another benefit, another way you can use suffering and problems is to find joy in doing positive actions and having positive thoughts. So whether this is related to strict Dharma practice or doing compassionate acts or meditating on loving kindness or reciting certain mantras, there's like many things are regarded as positive actions, but the most powerful ones are related to generating minds of compassion, and especially if you can generate the mind of bodhicitta. So then the sixth benefit of suffering or problems suggested by Dodro Rinpoche, I'll read it out. Using suffering to train in compassion. Reflect on how, just like yourself, all other sentient beings are oppressed with the same or even greater suffering. Train yourself in thinking how good it would be if they too were to be free of all this suffering. So this is an obvious benefit of problems or suffering. So, and again, it's kind of generating that thought of equalizing and exchanging self for others. So when we're experiencing a suffering or particular suffering or problem, then I think we all know that by our experience of that problem, it makes us much more sympathetic to other people who are experiencing that same problem. So I know from my example, I once had shingles when I was in India. And unfortunately, there is an antiviral medicine you can take, but you only have a 72-hour window of opportunity to take it. And after that, it's not effective. And I was in Bodh Gaya, so I wasn't sure that the medicine I took, I just missed the 72 hours because I didn't realize what I had. I'd never had anything like that before. So I just missed the 72 hours. And in any case, there are so many bogus fake drugs in India. Even what I took may not have been something that could have helped me. But anyway, so then I went through the most pain I've ever experienced in my life. I had it on my left sciatic nerve, the longest nerve in the body, just to make it really fun. And if you don't get it treated in time, it's quite an amazing experience. And so now I feel really compassionate whenever I hear anyone has shingles, because I know the kind of pain that's involved in it. And I have a sincere wish from my heart that no living being ever experienced shingles. And when I got back to Australia, Lasum, the nun I live with, she was a nurse. And she said in her day when she was on the wards, they used to put some people on shingles on suicide list because the pain can be so overwhelming that some people actually had suicidal thoughts. And it lasts for a long, long time. And even now, I think I have some twinges that I think, oh no, I hope it's not coming back. And it's like, you know yourself, if you suffer from any particular illness, whether mental or physical, because of your own experience of the suffering that's involved, you're much more empathetic to people who are going through similar experiences. And so what we can use our problems for, our sufferings for, is to increase our compassion. So in the text, compassion is defined as simply the wish for other beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and the causes of suffering are negative karma and delusions. And so whenever we're experiencing even the smallest problem, let alone the big ones like grief and loss and different things, or serious illness, life-threatening illness, is to immediately think about the other people who are experiencing a similar thing. And of course, for many of these things, people are experiencing them in much worse situations than we are, because we have a certain privilege in the way we exist, So when I was in Bodh Gaya, I felt, when I was thinking about other people with shingles, I thought about poor Indians in the same country as me who wouldn't have necessarily any support during their illness. I had a lot of support. I was living in a Dharma center, meals were provided, people were checking in on me, people were trying all kinds of treatments, none of which did much good. So it's like to think about the other people who have the same problem as you and maybe have it in a worse form. And from there, as much as you can, to extend whatever your problem is, to extend that compassion out with the wish that every single living being who's experiencing any problem, big or small, be free from that suffering. Because once you've experienced and once you're aware of the experience of the suffering, you yourself want to be free from it. And every single person is just like you and wanting to be free from suffering. So you try to open your heart and expand your compassion, expand your awareness of the suffering of others. And I don't think necessarily, we can't anyway, go through every suffering to feel this kind of compassion and empathy with those who are suffering, because at the moment, you just have to watch the news or catch up on the news to be given many opportunities to generate this mind of compassion, especially in terms of the pandemic in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, the different countries where people are suffering a lot. So we have opportunities every day in people and situations we come across, even personally in our daily lives, to generate compassion. And particularly in the media, anything because I follow now the example of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who makes a prayer before he watches the news, that anyone he sees or hears about on the news who's died or is suffering, or particularly who's died, that you pray for all of them to be born in a pure land, and failing that, to take a perfect human rebirth and meet perfect teachings and perfect teachers and complete the path to enlightenment. And this is something we can practice in daily life, because even in our lives here, example, termites in Tashi House, there's a lot of death in our environment, especially when we look at the level of insects or animals, So it's not that we don't have the opportunity to generate the mind of compassion, because if we think about what we're exposed to even in our everyday life, we have many opportunities to wish others to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. This is a definite benefit. And the other thing, Dodrupa Rinpoche, he mentions it next. I usually have it as a separate one. You can use suffering to train in loving kindness or love. And he says here, this will bring an understanding of how to practice loving kindness, the aspiration to help those who have no happiness. But loving kindness or love is defined as the wish for other living beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness, which are positive thoughts and actions. So again, when you're feeling some kind of suffering or problem, when you're distressed, what you want is happiness. And so again, that's the thing of thinking about the causes of happiness. But just as you wish to have happiness and to be free of whatever suffering you're experiencing, it's the same for every living being. There's not a single living being who wants to suffer. And then at one stage when I was being tricky, I thought, oh, well, how about a masochist? But actually, the suffering they experience gives them pleasure. So the reason they involve in the relationships they do is because that brings them happiness, or what they label as happiness. So every single living being is just like you in wanting even the smallest happiness and not wanting even the smallest suffering. So anytime you're experiencing suffering, then you can bring this strongly to mind and increase your loving kindness and compassion. So then here, Dodrupa Rinpoche, as the seventh and final benefit that he has for using suffering and problems in the path to enlightenment, he says you can use suffering for the meditation on others being more dear than oneself. And then he says, since the very reason why you are not free from suffering is that you have cherished yourself as most important since time without beginning, now you should practice thinking, I will cherish others, for this is the source of all happiness and well-being. So in relation to this, I'll talk about it more and more extensively tomorrow morning. So this is quite a famous practice called Tonglen. It leads into the practice of Tonglen, where you actually make prayers to take on the sufferings of others and give them all your happiness. And so it's a graded meditation, a graded course that we'll go through in more detail tomorrow morning. So what Dodrupa Rinpoche is pointing out here, and it's the basis for meditating on Tonglen and generating bodhicitta through the method of equalizing, exchanging self for others, is that first, when you're doing these meditations, you have to generate that mind of equanimity. And so the simplest, most direct way, and the way that's related more to thought training, mind training practices, is the method of generating bodhicitta through equalizing and exchanging self for others. And so for me, because there is the alternative method where you meditate on equanimity and you see all beings as having been your mother and being kind, but that takes also belief in past lives and a certain faith in the Buddhist presentation of spiritual development. But this to me is a very equalizing and exchanging self for others, is a very direct way to start to work towards bodhicitta, because it's that simple fact that the lamas say over and over again, that you read over and over in the text, is that every single living being is just like you in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. So that's the basic equality, the basic equanimous mind you can have before you start to meditate on Tonglen. It's just that recognition of that fellow feeling, if you like, that we all have as living beings, that none of us want suffering, even the smallest suffering, and we all want happiness. And the problem is we're confused about ways to find that happiness and to be devoid of that suffering. But at least we should have the recognition that every single living being doesn't want to suffer and wants happiness. And then on the basis of that, we'll explore it more tomorrow, you then have to see the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the benefits of cherishing others. And then after you've thought about and meditated on those topics, then you reach the point where you're actually able to exchange yourself for others. You not only equalize yourself with others and have a fellow feeling, but you actually sacrifice yourself in a sense, and you're willing to take on the sufferings and the negativities of others and to give all the good things to them. But we'll discuss it more tomorrow morning. So then previously when I've discussed this text, I've come up with another couple of ways to use suffering or problems in the path to enlightenment. And it's not that they're not covered by Dodritra Rinpoche, but they're not put separately. So what I think, one of the things I think of is that when you have a problem or a suffering, it's always a reminder of impermanence. That, so it's like you can be going along quite happily and then suddenly things change, if suffering or problem comes. And again, it can be quite a shock to our system and we think, why me? And this is amazing that this happened. But again, it's just the impermanent nature of samsara. It's just, again, reminding you of the type of existence that you're caught in, that it's impermanent, that it's changing. And it's essential in terms of having the energy and determination to do Dharma practice, to have insight into impermanence, especially in terms of death. Because otherwise, as I was explaining this morning, our tendency is to procrastinate, to think that, oh, it's all spiritual practice is fine and it's all very well, but I'm busy now, I've got many things to do. And when I'm maybe, depending how old you are, when I'm 40 or, you know, when I'm 50 or 60 or when I retire from work, then I'll concentrate on my spiritual practice. But there's no guarantee that we get to reach those ages. And when you're young and healthy, you think, you think you have all the time in the world, but you just have to look around to know that we don't die in order. And the texts say it'd be all very well to have this kind of idea if we were guaranteed that we'd live to be 40 and be healthy for 20 years. We could say, okay, maybe the last 20 years I'll do my spiritual practice, I'll do my Dharma practice. But none of us has any guarantee that about how long we're going to live, when we're going to die, and in what circumstances. So when a problem or suffering arises, when things change basically in your life and change in a negative way, it's just a reminder of impermanence. And the way I use it is it's a reminder that I shouldn't waste so much time. I shouldn't procrastinate so much, that it's important to practice a spiritual path while I have the capability to do it. Because things do change all the time, even though we might think we have ideal circumstances now. As we can see from the pandemic, circumstances can quickly change. And we may not have the opportunity that we thought we would have when we'd done what we thought was more important to do than spiritual practice. So anytime you have a suffering or problem, then you can remember impermanence and use it as an impetus to increase your spiritual practice. And another one I usually add to this list, it's dealt with a little later in the text in terms of absolute truth, the second division. But I like to insert it here in this list because I think it's quite an important one. So you can use whatever suffering or problem you experience as a reminder of emptiness. So whatever you're experiencing, you have to think about dependent arising, and you have to think about what we discussed a little bit this morning about how things appear to us through the process of labeling. And so Lama Zopa has quite an effective way of treating this. So he adds merely labeled to descriptions of situations. So, if you're experiencing a problem, he would say you could meditate on the fact that the merely labeled I is experiencing the merely labeled problem of a merely labeled illness, for example. So I find that this often gives you sort of space in your mind, because what tends to happen when we have a suffering or problem, especially if we feel it's big and overwhelming, is, of course, we see everything as truly existent, but somehow that big problem is really truly existent, concretely existent from its own side. And this is a way of loosening our hold, our tight hold on the concreteness of our view and our projection about the problem. And we've already discussed how even problem is just a label that we apply to a situation. And I'm sure in your own life and in the sort of hearing about the lives of others, there are many circumstances that initially we regard as large problems or big sufferings, label them as problems, and they seem to exist as problems, that actually turn out to have benefits for us. And there are even situations where people say after the experience, usually not usually during the experience of a problem or suffering, that they're glad it happened, that the changes that happened in their lives were so beneficial. And this is usually people who are quite resilient and who, whether consciously or unconsciously, can apply thought transformation, thought training to difficult situations, that their lives are better after the suffering experience than they were before. So just be aware when you're experiencing something like an illness, for example, just even to think the merely labeled I, to me, loosens up that tight hold, that concrete hold on the truly existent I. And to call it a merely labeled illness also helps to soften that tight grasping to a truly existent, inherently existent illness. So any problem, any suffering we experience, it can be like this, that it can be like a reminder of emptiness. That the merely labeled I is experiencing a merely labeled problem. And by applying these various methods outlined by Dodrupchen Rinpoche, you can see how that suffering or problem is a mere label, and that by applying these methods, you get the opportunity to actually make progress on the spiritual path, that they're not concretely or self-existently a problem. It's the fact that you've labeled them in that way, and then you've believed in your label and you see the situation in that way and then act accordingly, but that you have choice about how you label a situation. And so I can't remember it. There's a quite popular slogan, something like there are no problems, only opportunities, something like that. So thought training can be like that, you know, that you don't have to label things in a negative way. You can see them as opportunities to develop your mind in the spiritual path. And the other thing I used to add to this list, in addition to Dodrupche's 7 points, is that you can use suffering and problems to increase your resilience and self-confidence. So the way, or your self-esteem, if you like. So the way this works is by not avoiding problems and rejecting problems and always labeling them as negative, by actually engaging with them and using them in a constructive way, and succeeding in transforming them into something positive in your life, can be a basis for increasing your own self-confidence and self-esteem. So next, after that list of 7, then Dodrupchen Rinpoche says, it is extremely difficult to use suffering as the path when it stares you right in the face. That is why it is essential to become familiar beforehand with these practices to be applied in problematic situations, and also why it is particularly useful to apply a practice which is most meaningful for you and of which you have a clear personal experience. So what he's saying here is that rather than being startled by sufferings and problems, we need to have done things like work our way through this list of possible ways to see problems as beneficial, as helpful in our spiritual development, find the one that resonates most with us, that we can apply easily in situations, and then train our mind in that, you know, that we need to have the techniques, we need to be familiar with the techniques before we're overwhelmed by problems. We need to prepare ourselves basically for facing problems. And the way to do it is to think about what he suggested and come up with your own positive ways of seeing problems and become familiar with applying them. And as I suggested, start with the small problems in your life, and then you won't be quite so overwhelmed. If you learn to apply these techniques, then you won't be overwhelmed when a big problem, a big disaster happens in your life. And so next he says, Simply for suffering to become of help to your practice is not enough. You must be sure to develop the strong, stable, and continuous sense of joy that comes from recognizing that it has happened. So this is the next stage in the process, where you're not only just accepting that problems happen, but that you're actually welcoming them. You're actually, in the case of the top practitioners, they actually invite problems to happen. But here you still feel joyful when a problem happens, which seems extraordinary to us at the moment, but it's because we haven't developed our mind to that stage. But by following these techniques, I've seen it in lamas, that it can be like this, that they just have a completely even mind in the face of what I would regard as a big disaster or a big problem. So then he says, whenever you practice what I have explained here, realize that this very suffering you experience is giving you tremendous help towards attaining the great lasting peace and happiness of the higher realms and liberation itself, which is so difficult to reach, and that it will go on and on being like this. Then even if your suffering is very intense, it will turn out to be an utterly joyful thing, like a sweet made of sugar mixed with cardamom and peppers, which doesn't sound like a very delicious thing to me, but obviously in ancient times that was a big treat. So then he advises, go over this in your mind very thoroughly again and again, and make this feeling of inner peace and happiness a habit. When you have done this, the overflowing abundance of happiness within your mind will make the suffering of the senses seem as if imperceptible. The ability of the mind not to be upset or harmed at all by suffering is in fact the criterion for overcoming illness through patience. You should appreciate that the same principle applies for overcoming things like enemies and harmful spirits. As I explained before, reversing the attitude of not wanting suffering is the foundation for making suffering become the path. This is because for as long as you lose heart and your mind is disturbed as a result of nervous anxiety, you simply cannot turn suffering into the path. By training and actually making suffering your path, you will also discover a new strength in your ability to be happy, since as a result of your experience developing your practice through using suffering, you'll become more and more cheerful. They say that if you gradually train yourself with small problems and sufferings in easy, gradual stages, then in the end, you will be able to handle even the big ones too. This should be your approach, because it is extremely difficult to have a valid experience of something which is beyond the scope of your own mind. So we'll finish there for today, and we'll recap some of that tomorrow. And then I'd just like to finish with some dedication verses from Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, in the dedication chapter, chapter 10. So just think that any positive energy, any merit that we've created together today by giving and listening to teachings are dedicated to these specific goals. Through the virtue of having done this first day of the course, may all living beings come to engage in the Bodhisattva's conduct. May all beings everywhere, plagued with sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. For as long as they remain in psychic existence, may their mundane happiness never decline, and may all of them uninterruptedly receive waves of joy from bodhisattvas. May the blind see forms, may the deaf hear sounds, and just as it was with Maya Devi, may pregnant women give birth without any pain. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food, may the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find new hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their illness, and may every disease in the world, especially COVID-19, never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting one another. May no living creature ever suffer, commit wrong, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, or their minds ever be depressed. In all temples and monasteries, may reading and recitation flourish and remain. May the Sangha always be in harmony. May their purposes be accomplished. May sentient beings again and again make offerings to all the Buddhas, and may they be constantly be joyful with the inconceivable bliss of the Buddhas. Just as they intended, may the Bodhisattvas fulfill the welfare of the world. And may all sentient beings receive whatever the Buddhas have intended for them. And then just finally, one of the favorite dedication verses of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. So thank you all very much, and I hope you all reached home safely. And the next session will be at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so you can come online then for that. Thank you. Oh, one comment? Oh, could I share the prayer to you? Oh, okay. Does she mean type in? No, so I'll just repeat it. So before you watch the news, knowing that these days you see much more, because I remember when I was first in India, I was shocked by how they used to have photos of dead bodies in the newspapers, which used to be refrained from here. But now you see on the TV news and in newspapers and online many more dead bodies. So before watching the news, then what you usually pray is that may anybody I see who's died immediately be born in a pure land of Buddha, where there's no suffering. Failing that, may they quickly take a perfect human rebirth, meet perfect unmistaken teachings and a perfect unmistaken guru, and quickly actualize all the realizations of the path to enlightenment and become fully enlightened. So if you remember to do that before the news, then it kind of covers every unfortunate situation that you see in the news. So thank you. See you tomorrow.